Hello, my name is Jasmine. I'm the communications manager at the BlueGreen Alliance, and today I will be kicking us off for our webinar highlighting the 48C opportunity. We are hosting this in partnership with the Rocky Mountain Institute, and we also have a speaker here from the Department of Energy. And today we're going to be going over the 48C Advanced Energy Project Tax Credit and how you can apply for this program. This is going to be a series, and so we also have another session on June 6th with more tips on how you can build a competitive application for the 48C program. And then we'll be sending the registration link as long as all of the resources that we'll be displaying throughout this webinar and an after webinar email. And we encourage you to join us again in a couple of weeks for that second part. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted after the webinar is over to the BlueGreen Alliance YouTube channel so that you can view it later if you would like. And we will also, like I said, send this in the email that we have. We have a number of panelists here today, all experts in their field. They'll speak with you for about 5 to 15 minutes on their area of expertise, and then we'll follow it up with the Q&A session. Questions can be submitted in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting questions throughout the webinar, so feel free to submit them as you think of them. All viewing participants are muted with no video, so the only way you'll be able to submit a question is via that Q&A function. So with that, I will now turn it over to Ted Furtick to kick off the rest of the show.
Thanks, Jasmine, and good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Ted Furtick. I'm the Vice President of Manufacturing and Industrial Policy at the BlueGreen Alliance. Our organization is a coalition uniting labor unions and environmental organizations to solve today's environmental challenges in ways that create and maintain quality jobs. It's BGA's core belief that we shouldn't have to choose between good-paying jobs and a clean environment. And if you agree, the suite of federal investments offered by the Department of Energy can help you make good on that promise. The 48C tax credit is specifically designed to fund clean energy manufacturing and reduce emissions in U.S. industry is responsible for about a third of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. And in the coming years, we need to take significant collective action to reduce pollution and preserve a livable climate for future generations. And we need to grow our workforce to get it done. Companies can receive up to 30% of their total project costs through the 48C program, provided the project meets the required labor standards. The BlueGreen Alliance wants to see projects that will deliver the climate, job, environmental, and health benefits our communities deserve. In this funding round, there is $2.5 billion available specifically for energy communities, and BGA is especially motivated to encourage applications that will take advantage of this dedicated funding. At BGA, we have advocated for the importance of community benefits and workforce plans throughout the making of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and at every stage of the implementation process. And we've supported companies as they have worked to develop strong workforce and community engagement plans that solidify a commitment to the local area impacted by their projects. It's our belief that a good community and workforce engagement plan is the pathway to a strong tax credit application. So the panelists here are the experts on how to secure federal funding for your next clean energy project. Throughout this two-part webinar series, we will discuss what sorts of investments these funds can support, how to build a competitive application, and answer questions about the 48C program, so you are prepared to submit before the concept note deadline on June 21st. In part 2 of our webinar series on June 6th, we will look closer at existing clean technology supply chains in the US and where they are concentrated, how energy communities can best position themselves to get funding from 48C, and how companies should think about community and workforce engagement plans when working on their applications. But today we'll have 3 speakers. First, we're going to have Zach Valdez, who's a strategic advisor in the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains at the Department of Energy. Zach is going to give an overview of MESC's mission, a summary of 48C and round 2, and share some information on priority sectors and on energy communities. Second, we're going to have Aaron Brickman, who is the senior principal of the U.S. program at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who will give a bit of an overview of RMI and talk about how EDOs can support companies applying for 48C. And lastly, we'll have Elisa Peterson, who's the federal policy manager in the U.S. program at RMI, sharing some additional information on 48C and providing some recommendations for what a good 48C application should look like. After Lisa finishes, we should have about 15 minutes for the Q&A. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Zach to give us an overview of the 48C program.
Thanks, Ted. I really appreciate it. And I want to say thanks to BGA and RMI for providing this opportunity to just showcase what we're looking for in round two. If you could bring up the slides, I'd be happy to kind of provide some insight on how things are changing, what we're really looking into, and provide more of a background into how DOE has changed and what we're looking into. So we can go to full slide mode. My name's Zach Valdez. I am a strategic advisor for the Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chain Office. That is actually under the new Office of the Undersecretary for Infrastructure, which is really looking to move from what DOE has done at an amazing job, which is moving basic science to applied R&D. And so through bill and bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding, we're looking at what does the commercialization or scaling of existing technologies look like. And so realistically, if you go to the next slide, we started out with the 2009 Recovery Act and expanded that to $10 billion this time. So the initial 48C really just looked at the clean energy manufacturing piece, but we've expanded that to recycling, adding a critical materials component and industrial decarbonization projects. You may be aware that we released about $4 billion or selected projects worth about $4 billion in tax credits in March, but we're now opening it up. So we have up to $6 billion left, and of that $6 billion, $2.5 billion of it will be dedicated to energy communities. I'll get into that a little bit more, but a few of the other bullet points I want to tackle on this left-hand side are the investment tax credit, if you don't know, can be up to 30% of your investment, initial 6%, and then the other 24% based on apprenticeship and prevailing wage requirements. There's also a unique opportunity for direct pay. So if you are a public organization or a tribal group that don't necessarily have those tax pathways or infrastructure, you can leverage that direct pay. And there's also some transferability going around. On the right-hand side, there is no project size. We ask you to use your own due diligence in terms of what you're asking for, but we do not predetermine the funding allocated. If you go to the next slide, here's digging a little bit deeper into what we're actually looking for. So as I had mentioned, the clean energy manufacturing was in that initial 2009 envelope, but we've added recycling. And so that's really looking at re-equipping, expanding, or establishing those facilities for clean energy and energy efficient technologies. So we're really, across all these, I would say what we're trying to do is eliminate vulnerabilities in the clean energy supply chain. And how do we bring not only those capabilities, but also that existing workforce back to the United States? Another part of that, if you move upstream of all technologies, is consistent with where are the critical materials and how do we process them to make the components that we need to be effective. So that is the second sort of vertical. And then the last one is industrial decarbonization. So how are we going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by at least 20% in a lot of these energy intensive facilities? And so that's really pushing to look at for existing facilities, where can we help not only reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but oftentimes that means reduce the energy burden of those facilities. Next slide, please. So I'd like to provide people an example of what went through round one, because with those $4 billion in tax credits, we actually received over $40 billion in requests. So we had a 10x request on what we were able to provide. So it was a competitive market. But you can see that a lot of the bulk here went to the clean energy manufacturing recycling projects, with the remaining amount going into critical materials and industrial decarbonization. But realistically, I think the other thing that you can pull out of this is the technologies that we fund are pretty, they're all over the map, right? It's manufacturing, it's hydrogen, it's iron and steel, it's lithium ion battery recycling. So We ask that you go through the guidance and find those priorities that are best fit. And then work within that to build your concept paper and application. Next slide, please. I like to provide this just as a mechanism to guide yourself. We are just a few days beyond that bottom first arrow. So the portal actually opened yesterday, and you have 30 days to submit a concept paper. You must submit a concept paper to submit an application. When you submit that concept paper, and I'll go into a little bit more detail maybe if needed, you may get encouraged or discouraged. If you get discouraged through a concept paper because maybe you didn't have enough time to do a thorough job, that does not deter or stop you from being able to submit an application. And then you have about 50 days once the application window opens, and we hope to make notifications by early next year. Next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to go through were round 2 priorities, and these are in no way in sort of the prioritized arena, but some of the things that we're really looking at are hydrogen grid, electric vehicles. The new one that I want to mention here is this low carbon energy intensive materials. So that is referring to at least a 30% reduction when compared to appropriate industry benchmark. So, or maybe this isn't a good one, but my keys here take 10 kilograms of carbon to make. If I can reduce that down to 70%, that's a low carbon energy intensive material reduction. So we're kind of thinking about it in that way. And what ways are you sort of reducing those inherent carbon risks? There's also the 45X production tax credit. You cannot stack those credits. But one thing that I will mention, and this is not tax advice, but maybe just a reference, if you look, in some cases for DOE programs, you can stack a tax credit on the company who is providing the funding. So let me just put it in easy terms. If we have a project at MESC that is a $100 million project, we provide 50% through our grant to support that. Then you have a 50% investment on your end. You can use the tax credit on your $50 million moving forward. Next slide, please. So determining eligibility, we're looking at if you define the scope, provide examples of eligible projects, and what we'll do is go through quickly to help you identify if you're eligible. You must identify where you're going to sit in any one of those individual verticals. And if you go to the next slide, here are some of the main things that we want to be clear on coming from round 1 that can really help folks develop better applications. So I've talked about what's eligible in terms of clean energy manufacturing and recycling projects, but what's ineligible. And so this includes facilities producing fuels or chemicals, except the ones that are producing a chemical that is a component of eligible 48C. So we're looking at the product and not the component, and also ones that are deploying. So that's sort of maybe later stage in the manufacturing process for this case. Next slide, please. For critical materials, it's really we are interested in everything after the mining or extraction, but not including the derivative products. So as it mentions there, those may be in another category, but DOE in general, we focus on everything post once it's out of the ground. Next slide, please. And then for industrial decarbonization, we want to provide funding or support for projects that involve retrofitting industrial manufacturing facilities, not expanding on ones that are already doing a really good job at decarbonization. So if you're making something and you're saying, if we increase by 2x, we will actually reduce, carbon. I think we're looking for actual retrofits on top of that facility to support those efforts. So I don't want to provide any examples, but carbon capture and things like that is another good option. Next slide, please. All right. So most important, well, maybe not most importantly, but one of the things we've done recently is expand our energy community. So those orange tracks are areas that have been added to the 2004. And if you scan that QR code, you'll get some frequently asked questions. Identify that. The important part here is that these are communities which were former coal communities. There's $2.5 billion, up to $2.5 billion, that is sort of allocated to just these communities. So these tracks are sort of competing for that 2.5 billion, whereas the rest of the country has got the other 3.5. That's important because a lot of these areas generally aren't near major metropolitan cities. And also they have existing infrastructure to support some of the capabilities that you have. So what we find are these communities are ready to bring in new business to build back their economy after these coal communities. And we just don't do matchmaking, and we hope that you can convene in those spaces. Next slide, please. The last thing that I want to go through here is the manufacturing capital connector. This is really looking to bring in the financial institutions to support these clean energy projects. And so as we connect that sort of third tier, so you have communities, the program or the project, and then the financial sector, one of the unique things about the tax credits is really you have to have a lot of your funding up front. And so these are opportunities to help secure some of that capital. Next slide, please. So what will happen is once you log in, there's an opportunity to sort capital providers by best practices and then share your information with those, because this is federal tax information that is protected. So you're opting in to support this effort through providing these capital connectors to your project to determine whether or not they are interested in co-investing. Next slide, please. And so what we're really looking at doing is educating both the financial sector, because oftentimes these areas of clean energy technology development are less aware by the financial institutions, to increase the flow of capital to these to really improve the project success, and then also really honing in on those best practices for those capital providers. So we hope that this is something that potential applicants can leverage effectively. Next slide, please. The concept paper submission requirements have been, I want to use the word simplified, to use a PDF template where we, as you can see there, have some cues with character limits rather than more of a story form expectation. Next slide, please. The submission window, as I mentioned, just opened up yesterday and will close in mid-June. You must have that concept paper in to submit an application. Next slide, please. I will also say that we have provided a simplified or maybe an easier to use portal to support 48C questions and comments and submitting your applications and concept papers. We used an outside vendor to support this so that we can make it a little bit more easy to manage. So we ask that you go to that portal to get some of the questions answered or to start your application. Next slide, please. I'll just leave this up. You know, DOE does not do tax-related advice. And to be honest, I don't think IRS does either. But here are some links to areas that may provide more support. Next slide, please. I think that's all I have. I think we'll hold off on questions, but I look forward to sticking around and answering them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach, for that comprehensive overview. Aaron, can I kick it over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. And that was great, Zach. And for some of you, good morning. I'm Aaron Brickman, and I lead economic development initiatives at RMI. Before coming to RMI, I spent 15 years working with global companies investing in America and also advising economic development organizations. I helped lead an association and also created and led Select USA, which is the National Investment Promotion Agency for the US at the United States Department of Commerce. So I'm really excited to be with you today because of the enormous potential for regional economic development impact that 48C can have across the entire country. It's a big deal. At RMI, we know economic development organizations and practitioners are critical to US competitiveness in clean energy and clean tech. Prioritizing our work with state, regional, and local EDOs because you play unique roles in facilitating job creation, CapEx, and projects through your critical business retention, expansion, and attraction efforts. 48C is all of the above in terms of an incentive with impact to capture opportunities related to some of the fastest growing industrial sectors globally. So over the past 2 years, RMI has worked in at least a dozen states, helping EDOs to maximize opportunities through the Inflation Reduction Act, ensuring practitioners are aware of the powerful nature of the IRA as an unprecedented economic development tool. We've done deep research and analysis, produced strategies, convened diverse stakeholders, engaged workforce and community development organizations and political leaders. We've run trainings and boot camps, staying high level or diving in for one team or 50, meeting you and your peers where you are, because our mission is to maximize these and other clean energy incentives for industrial expansion, manufacturing supply chain jobs, and economic growth. We've been tireless because that's how you are. So EDOs play vital roles in communities and states day in and day out, and that extends to 48C. You will be important connectors to companies in your footprint who would be ideal candidates for this catalytic incentive. As you digest what you learned today and begin to identify companies you think are well positioned, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to my colleague, Elisa, following today's webinar. Of course, other speakers as well. Like Zach, I also do not dispense tax advice. We'd be happy to get into the weeds, though, with you as you strategize for your own region or state or locality. So huge thanks to the BlueGreen Alliance for partnering with us on this 2-part webinar series. And to Zach, always love listening to you. And now, without further ado, over to you, Elisa.
Thanks, Aaron. So hi, I'm Elisa Peterson. I'm a federal policy manager here at RMI. And I've pretty much been living, breathing IRA for the last 3 years. First, I worked on IRA at the congressional level, trying to help inform policy so that it could be as impactful as possible. Then, at the agency level, working with agencies to design the programs to be useful. And now that the programs are largely designed, now focus more kind of at the subnational level on uptake to make sure we can actually see kind of the big impact that we think IRA can have. Let's skip a couple slides. One more. Thank you. Oh, one more. Thank you. And I'll dive a little bit more into 48C. So just to set the stage, well, Zach set the stage, but let me expand on that stage of this is kind of the last opportunity for 48C, and it's $6 billion. There could be more funding that would come through legislative text at a future date, but as of right now, it's kind of like this is the last round and then the funding's gone. So as an economic development officer, we have 30 days to put in, to work with businesses to put in a concept paper. This might be kind of like the last opportunity for a large pot of funding to go towards clean tech manufacturing and industrial decarb. And so it's important to think about where you might want to focus your efforts, knowing that you don't have that much time and it will be competitive. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the domestic content, how that kind of sets the stage for clean tech manufacturing. Then I'll speak a little bit about how 48C compares to the other clean energy manufacturing tax credit 45X. So you can decide maybe which projects might make more sense under which category. I'll lightly touch on energy communities, and then I'll end with a quick overview of the kind of the winners and some of the takeaways from the last round of funding that I was able to see. So let's go to the next slide. So the Inflation Reduction Act was designed in a really interesting way. Essentially, they didn't want to just have uptake of clean energy technologies. They also wanted to make sure that those clean energy technologies were built in the US and were creating good, clean paying jobs. And so they kind of took both the carrot and the stick approach in order to build out this clean energy manufacturing in the US. So first I'll talk about the stick. And the stick was used to really increase the demand for domestic supply. So the first is the EV tax credit was designed in a way where if you don't assemble it in North America, if you don't meet certain battery requirements or critical mineral requirements, you actually can't claim the tax credit like you could before. And when this was designed, our supply chain was not set up to meet these requirements. And so there's been a large uptake in trying to build out that supply chain. So EVs, batteries, critical materials, that's a key area where we need to build out the supply chain. There's also some requirements around the renewable tax credits, where if you don't meet the domestic content requirements, eventually you won't be able to take direct pay. So this also builds out the need for clean manufacturing of solar and wind within the US. A desire for, if we're building out this clean manufacturing, making sure that these jobs are good quality jobs. And so most of these tax credits do have prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And then finally, this wasn't built in IRA, it was actually through the bipartisan infrastructure law. But there's also this Build America, Buy America requirement that is specific to iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction material. And some IRA projects, programs like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund have to meet those requirements. So this kind of builds the demand for battery, critical mineral, EV, renewables, iron, steel. Those are the things that we need to really increase for domestic manufacturing. We also, if you could click to the next thing. Sorry, just click on the, we also wanted to increase the supply. So IRA created a new manufacturing tax credit called 45X, and they gave $10 billion to 48C, which is the tax credit that we're talking about today. They also added some bonuses for if you could meet domestic content requirements at the renewable level, you could get a 10% higher adder. So they wanted to kind of sweeten the pot, and 48C is one of the ways to do that. Next slide, please. And it really did work. This is a map of new energy manufacturing that has happened in the US since 2018. You can see that there's been a lot, and it's really in the places where domestic content requirements were set within IRA. So batteries, critical minerals, solar. Next slide. But even though we are seeing this big boom in clean energy manufacturing, there is still a long way to go in order to actually meet those domestic content requirements that were set in IRA to make sure that you can actually still achieve those tax credits and benefit from them. This is an analysis RMI did on the battery supply chain, and anything in light blue is a supply gap where we are not able to meet the supply chain needs in the US today. So there's a large need to still increase supply chain uptake. And so as we're thinking about 48C, thinking about where there are gaps that need to be filled in order to meet IRA domestic content requirements will be a really important piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, there were actually two manufacturing tax credits. There's 48C, which is the one we're talking about, and there's 45X. And these are two very different credits. They serve different purposes, but in some instances, they serve. And so I wanted to just talk about why you might choose one over the other. And especially if, with a limited amount of time, if there's a project that maybe makes more sense for 45X, then, you can focus on the ones that make more sense for 48C over the next month, and then maybe, turn to those projects at a later date. So 45X is a production tax credit, which means that it's a per unit tax credit that's based on the eligible units produced over a set period of time. Whereas 48C is a one-time investment tax credit that's that 30% cost of the eligible capital investment. Both of them are eligible for elective pay, but 45X is a little bit more generous in that it allows all entities to claim elective pay for a short period of time, whereas 48C is really just for non-taxable entities. You can do transferability for either of them as well. 45X is not competitive. It is an uncapped tax credit, which means that if you meet the qualifications for getting this tax credit, you automatically get it. Whereas 48C, as you know, is competitive. You need to apply for it. There's only $6 billion remaining. In terms of incentive amounts, this really varies widely. 45X has different incentive values based on the product that you're looking at. But I would say 45X tends to be a little more generous than 48C. Definitely worth diving deeper on your specific project, but that's the general sense that I've heard. In terms of what's covered, this is what really varies. So for 45X, it's really just a manufacturing tax credit, and it's focused on solar, wind, inverters, critical materials, and batteries. So it's a little bit more limited than 48C. 48C can cover broader clean tech manufacturing. It also covers industrial decarbonization and critical material projects. And so that's a place where, if 45X is not covered, or if your project isn't covered under 45X, it would make sense to prioritize 48C. And then the prevailing wage piece, 45X does not require it, whereas 48C does require it to get that full incentive value. And so I think the general takeaway here is that both of these tax credits are useful. They both serve their purpose. But if you have a project that qualifies for 45X, it might make sense to focus your efforts there as opposed to 48C, and really focus your efforts on 48C where it can't be served elsewhere. Next slide, please. And so this just kind of summarizes that point more. This talks about what's covered in 45X, the specific components that are eligible for incentives. And I should mention, we put together a one-pager on both 45X and 48C that we'll share in the follow-up email. So you can kind of compare and contrast on your own. That one-pager will include incentive values for 45X. So the areas to really focus on for 48C then are the industrial decarbonization projects. Those aren't covered in 45X. Things like heat pumps, which those are in the priority list that DOE set. They want to do manufacturing of air source heat pumps, particularly for the industrial application, and that's not covered anywhere else. That's also not a project that appears to have been funded in the first round. And so it was on the first round of priorities, it's on the second round of priorities. If you have a project like that, probably it would be pretty competitive. Additionally, energy intensive materials. I mentioned America Buy America requires American iron and steel. Now this 48C can cover low carbon iron and steel. So if we're building out American iron and steel anyway, it would be a pretty interesting opportunity to build out low carbon iron and steel in the US using 48C. And then electric grid and hydrogen, that was covered in the first round, but still on the priority list, not covered in 45X, so still an area to focus. And then finally, I'll just mention solar, wind, and battery and critical material components. Most of them are covered under 45X, but there are select ones that are not covered under 45X that would qualify under 48C. And so just making sure that if you're manufacturing a component within those supply chains, they're covered under 45X will be important. For example, like recycling of wind blades is not in 45X, but would be in 48C. Next slide. And this is just, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this is just showing you that we do know the incentive amount for each manufactured component and roughly what % of the current price this is. This is in that one pager that I mentioned. So let's go to the next slide. All right, my next point that we're going to hit much harder on the second webinar, but I just wanted to emphasize it here because I think it's important, is that we really do want to see more projects in energy communities. Last round, there's 4 billion awarded and 1.5 billion is in energy communities. But if you do the math on that, they wanted 40% in energy communities. So there was about $100 million of projects funded, less funded than desired in energy communities. And so if you do have sites and energy communities that you can identify, those projects are going to be more competitive, more desirable. And there is, I put it in the Q&A, but there's DOE has this great list of census tracts that qualify for being in energy communities that Jasmine could put in the chat. So if you are an economic development officer and you want to see which communities to focus on for that, you can review that reference. Next slide. And this is just a teaser for next time. We are going to go into more detail about this, but we've been working on this clean growth tool that will be released in a couple weeks that kind of identifies where certain clean technologies are best positioned to be deployed or be manufactured. And so we are currently looking at mapping that out against the energy community area. So you can identify, you know, okay, if I want to do low carbon iron and steel and I want it to be in an energy community, where might that best be served? And so, like I said, this is a draft. We will share it in 2 weeks, but if that is of interest to you, I know this is a timely thing, so please reach out and we're happy to share more information on that on a one-on-one level. Next slide. And then I'll end with just some lessons from round one. So this is an interactive map. Jasmine, maybe you could post the link in the chat for everyone. But this just maps out the winners from round one. This is not all the winners. You have to actually self-disclose if you want to share your information. So this is about half the winners' information. And you can kind of see where they're laid out in the US, kind of how many different projects were in different categories. But some of the takeaways I had were the range. So it's a large range of funding. 1.3 million is the smallest to 280 million, which is the largest. But I think that gives you a sense of like the size of these types of projects. They are pretty big projects. This is not a small administrative burden to try to use 48C. So if you're thinking about where to focus, potentially slightly bigger projects. Most of the award winners were in areas that DOE, if you have a project that's in the areas that DOE says they want projects, you're probably going to be pretty competitive. There were some projects, like heat pumps that DOE said that they wanted to prioritize that don't seem like they received any allocation, and they're still saying they want to prioritize. So especially if you have a project that has been on the priority list multiple times and was not funded, probably more competitive. Looking at the award winners, you can actually see most of them are pretty large established manufacturers. So again, kind of gives you a sense of where to potentially focus your attention given, a quick turnaround. And then just observation I had was that most of the industrial decarb projects were electrolyzer focused. There weren't many that were like industrial heat pumps or other things like that. So I think there is some opportunity for more of these types of projects. This was definitely the category that was least funded, and it seemed like it had the least variety. So there's a bunch of opportunity within the industrial space to decarbonize, and this is kind of like a pretty key opportunity. So let's make sure we don't miss that. That's it for me in terms of my takeaways. I'll pass it over to you, Ted, to go through the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And also again to Aaron and Zach. Fantastic stuff. So we're exactly on time with 15 minutes for the Q&A. So well done, everyone. We have, I think, one question so far that's in the Q&A. Just to remind everyone, you can use that feature on Zoom to post your questions and direct them to the panelists to answer. We have one question to start with, asking if there's a channel to connect with project developers still looking for qualifying sites. Wondering if our friends at DOE could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, there's not a specific channel, I will say that. I think one of the things that we're realizing is that there's a lost opportunity to bring these companies and projects into these energy communities, and so we're hoping that that happens at like the Economic Development Office or the Governor's Office to kind of develop those relationships to identify where those exist. As I mentioned, this program is really for projects that are pretty much shovel ready, and so if you're still looking for sites, that may mean that your application may not be as thorough as needed to be competitive.
Thanks, Zach. We have a question, can a manufacturing of construction projects, specifically developing sustainable green tiny houses, would such a manufacturer be eligible for this tax credit funding?
That definitely sounds like requesting tax advice that I would not, that's not my expertise. So I wouldn't be able to answer that. I would ask them to go to the guidance, identify if they have it.
One question I would like to just direct to the panel as a whole is specifically, we could say, what are some of the ways that an economic development organization can help to make a project more competitive? What advice would we give to economic development officials for how that they can best support some of the applications that may be coming from their home geographies?
Well, I think, in my experience, nobody knows their footprint, like their business footprint, at least like an economic development organization. And that includes the sort of quality and capability of individual companies and its management. And because of the BR&E work on a business retention and expansion, what companies are poised for in terms of expansion and thus taking advantage of a tax credit like 48C. So just the advice would be thinking of your most capable companies and down to those. So you're in this webinar because you've self-selected. Presumably nobody forced you to come, although tell me how they did that. If that's true, it will be helpful for the future. And then the second webinar is going to be really critical for companies in your footprint or that you work with that you think are then poised to take that step, right? So it's not going to be for everybody. And that level of engagement, one-off touch points, and then due diligence, which companies, why, reach out to us in the interim, and sort of that's it. I've never used the phrase it's a shoe leather operation thing, right? But it's like, your companies, now's the time to demonstrate that knowledge and connectivity to this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Aaron. One other question I would put to the group as a whole, to the extent it's possible to answer, but what sorts of questions should a company be prepared to answer or to address in their concept paper? Obviously, people can log into the portal and explore it themselves, but is there anything that it's possible to share in this space?
Yeah, I think having a very clear awareness of what isn't a good concept paper is important. I will say that, we're trying to give as much advice as possible without telling people, like directing people. But a few of the things that you may want to focus in on are, what are your community benefits plans, and having a very substantiate how the project meets the review merit criteria. It's also, as I already mentioned, probably pretty important to be permitted in place in the service within the required timeframes. So making sure you have that external infrastructure ready. The PDF template with the data sheet, do as much potential detail as possible on that with the concept paper, including costs that are also eligible for inclusion in a qualified investment. I think those are the main things. I know they sound pretty straightforward, but just being very thorough in that space.
Thanks, Zach. And just to remind everyone, we'll go into more depth on some of these things, and in particular on the community benefit and workforce plans aspect of it in our follow-up webinar that is scheduled for June 6th. Are there any other questions from the audience, from the participants? One more plug to put your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom.
So Ted, maybe I'll just opine for a moment here that economic development practitioners, so you really have an opportunity at this moment to deliver almost like the best greeting card your companies have ever received, right? It's an incentive that they almost certainly do not know currently exists. And so the challenge is to share that greeting card, explain why they need to pay attention, and focus your time on the most likely candidates for success for your community or region. And if you're a state EDO, and I see some familiar names there amongst the participants, I know you're at the state level, that becomes more challenging, but I know you have teams that focus on a regional level in your states, right? So it's annoying in some way, I could say, because it's so fast, yet there's this two-step process on the application. And so that makes it a little bit easier. And then we've got a two-step process with these webinars, right? So this is the first one. This is hey, this is happening. We really think you ought to pay attention to it, and then you then deliver that to your companies to say, this is something I think that we need, right? We're primed, but also it's a wonderful opportunity for the right companies. So I know there's an ask, but actually there's big reward, and trying to frame it in that manner.
Thanks, Aaron. Just once more to the rest of our panelists, if anybody has any closing thoughts that you'd like to share. I'm also going to ask if we can put the sign up link to register for the second webinar in the chat, so that participants here can sign up right away. Also, share it with anyone that you think would benefit. As a reminder, we will be posting this webinar to the BlueGreen Alliance's YouTube channel, and you can share that link with anybody that you think would benefit from seeing the information that was presented in this first of our 2 webinar series. And there, Jasmine has just shared the part 2 registration, and that link is live. So yeah. Elisa, Zach, Aaron, any parting thoughts for our guests here?
No, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I think at least at DOE, what we're trying to do is meet people where they are. So if there are regional or state events where people just want to see somebody from DOE, we have budgeted in to this program the opportunity to do that over the next 30 days, realizing that after that concept paper is due, the only folks that are really eligible for applications are the people that turn them in. So my final request would be, even if you don't think you have everything needed to fill out that concept paper, just submit one anyways. And even if you're discouraged, you can continue on with your application and keep pulling in that data. It's so important to get that concept paper in, to be able to play in the sandbox for the application. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Zach. That was a very important nudge at the end. Okay.
Well, I'll just say,
go ahead,
since everybody appears to be shy today, which is unusual for people in this line of work, I'd say think about your question, digest what you're hearing today, reach out to any of the speakers. You know, these are the kind of questions and issues that we want to answer, because we want you to succeed in this space with this program. So let's go get it. And thanks again, Ted, for hosting.
I just seeing we do have one question in the in the box. I'm not sure if anybody will be able to answer this, but one of the participants asks if that in the first round of funding included several electrolyzer manufacturers, and asking if the second round will favor hydrogen offtake productions more than production. I don't know if anybody's actually gonna be able to answer that, but if anybody can, go ahead and give it a whirl.
I wouldn't offer any sort of tax advice, and I would also say that we are not limiting it to round 1 and round 2, because realistically these things are 4 years to completion. So anything can happen in those 4 years, and we're not going to. It seems like the DOE would not place bets on one or the other.
Good. Okay, well, on behalf of BGA, I want to thank our panelists, Zach from the Department of Energy, Aaron and Elisa from RMI, and thank all of you for participating and joining us here today. Just one more plug that the link for the second webinar on June 6th is in the chat. We would love to have you there, and for you to bring any of your friends. And so with that, we'll close out the Zoom and say goodbye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.